Hi, I'm Mike Holt, and this little video is about how to use the National Electrical Code. Now, if you're probably watching, this is because you don't want to have a whole lot of experience with the National Electrical Code, and I'll tell you my little story. When I first started the trade, this was sitting on the dash of a pickup truck and a service truck, and it was all white. I didn't know why it was all white, and I decided I'm the electrician, or I'm going to be an electrician. I want to learn this. So I opened up the code book, and I started reading. And, after a little while, I realized, I'm reading and I have no clue what I've read. You ever read something and you realize you're not even there, your brain is zoned out, and I realize, okay, I'll put it back. Years later, I found out why it was white. Do you guys know why it was white?
In the sun.
It was in the sun, it was never used. It was just in the front of the pickup truck holding down the papers is all it was for. It really wasn't being used. Okay, so that was my experience. But after a while, I started learning how to use the National Electrical Code. So before we get to how to use it, let's understand the structure and the style of the National Electrical Code. You ready for this? Here we go. Number one, there's a table of content, and then you're going to have the code is broken down into chapters, chapters subdivided into articles, articles subdivided into parts, parts are subdivided into sections. Then there's tables and figures. Then there's going to be exceptions. There's informational notes. There's an annex, and there's an index. I didn't realize until just reading these last two slides, there's a lot of sections of the National Electrical Code. After been doing it for like 40 plus years, I don't even realize these things are constructed. But when I first got started, it was very intimidating. So that's the layout of the National Electrical Code. Let's take a look at each of these items separately. The table of content is on page 2 of the front of the code book, and it breaks down here. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, it talks about the parts, it talks about the Article 100, Article 110, and that's your table of content. I don't expect you to understand a whole lot other than to know page 2, table of content. Let's move on to the next one. Then the code book is broken down into chapters. Chapter 1 is your general, Chapter 2 is wiring and protection, 3 is wiring methods, Chapter 4 is equipment, Chapter 5 is special occupancy, special equipment, special conditions, Chapter 8 is communication, Chapter 9 is tables. Now, I'm not saying this for you to be able to take a quiz and know what the chapters are about, and I'd say I probably know the titles of all the chapters, but sometimes I get a little confused at times. So it doesn't really matter. I don't need to know. I just know that when I go to get to a section, I need to know what chapter I'm going to be getting into the code book, and you'll see how that works out. The next thing is to understand that the chapters are broken down into specific articles. An example, anything that's a 100, Article 100, that is in Chapter 1. Example, Article 250, grounding and bonding, Chapter 2. Article 300, wiring, Chapter 3. I'm just giving an example of a common one. Article 430, motors, Chapter 4. Hazard classified locations, Chapter 5. Article 500, swimming pools, 680, Chapter 6. Remote control circuits, Chapter 7. 725 is the article. Communication circuits is Chapter 8, 800. So code is broken into 9 chapters. There are articles within the 9 chapters, and as they're titled, 100, 110, Chapter 1, 250, 240, 210, Chapter 2, 400, 410, 425, 430, Chapter 4. So just kind of give you an idea. You have chapters, you have what is called articles. The next thing is that the chapters, and then you have the articles. Articles are broken down into parts. Example, Part 2 is a Class 1 circuit. Well, if we got into Article 725, we would see that there's a Part 1 general, there's a Part 2 that's Class 1, there's a Part 3 that's Class 2, and there's a Part 4 that's going to be Class 3. So you take an article that's kind of big, they're like, this is big, and it includes a lot of different things. They'll break it down into individual parts. Now, subdivision of the parts is going to be the actual code section. An example, Article 90 is not in a chapter, it's the introduction to the code book. 90.1 is called a section. For the longest time, I would use the reference of 90.1 or 250.122. I call it Article 90.1, or I'd call it Article 210.52. Tell you a story. EC&M magazine, as I started becoming a little well-known nationally, asked me, Mike, would you come to New York City and would you record an audio of the changes to the National Code? And of course, I'm a young kid of EC&M flying to New York City back in the 80s, and I'm like so excited. So I got the headset on, I got the speaker, I feel like I'm a rock star, I'm singing a song, I got the New York City, all the people running around, the whole thing. I'm speaking, I'm talking about the changes, and because I'm reading my books, I'm saying the whole thing, I get it all done. And I'm thinking, I did a pretty good job. But it's still intimidating. But what an experience to fly to New York City to record the audio of the changes. We didn't have videos at that time. This was before VHSs. This is audio. I get excited. They called me up about a week later, less than a week later. They said, Mike, really appreciate all your effort. We can't use any of the audio. I said, why not? They said, when you take a look at the slide, when you were talking about 90.1, they said you said Article 90.1. Joe McPartland, who was the Mike Holt of today, he was the Mike Holt of that day, and I was a young guy coming in there, and he said, Joe McPartland says you can't say Article 90.1 because it's not an article, Mike. It's Section 90.1. And in every single reference, you said the article. And I'm like, how humiliating is that to be corrected in that capacity rather than somebody saying, hey, David, it's not Article 90.1. It's section. And you're like, oh, okay, I appreciate that. But mine was an extreme way of learning not to use the wrong term. All right, let's go a little further than that. Next thing is there are tables in the code. Lots and lots and lots of tables. And, even on tables, they have like numbers. There's number 1 here. It says the number of conductors, total number. So tables, you have to slow down. You have to be aware. You have a highlighter. You make notes in there. You have your code book, you start customizing it. So there's tables in the code. There are exceptions, lots and lots of exceptions. They're identified by an exception, they're italicized, which means you have a basic rule. They say, yeah, we know these rules apply, but you know what? In an existing dwelling unit, guess what? We're going to do a different set of conditions. So we have exceptions to the section. Now this is a subsection because it's not a 90.1, it's a paren A, 2, 3, whatever the case may be. Informational notes. Lots and lots of notes are throughout the National Code. We'll probably have to do a search and find out how many informational notes are in the National Code. And I don't know, I'm going to guess it's probably around 500, but we're going to do a little search right now with the electronic version and find out what it is. Now, what's an informational note? It's exactly what it says. It's information purposes only. It's not a requirement. It's just say, listen, you know what? Think about this, or hey, go take a look at this, or give this as consideration, or an example. What we're talking about is this. So it's not a regulation. It's just a way to be able to inform us what it is. Okay. Let's take a look at this graphic and let's see what this says. So we're talking about the code contains provisions that are considered necessary for safety. So that's what the rule is telling us. Compliance with it in proper maintenance results in an installation that is essentially free from a hazard, but not necessarily efficient, convenient, or adequate for good service or future expansion of electric use. So that's what the rule is about. They're saying the code is for safety. Do we have an idea how many informational notes there are?
Quick search was 881.
So there's 881 notes to the code. Here is the first note in the code. This is 90.1b, adequacy. And the note says this: hazards often occur because of overloading of wiring systems by methods or usage not in conformity with the code. They're just telling you some information. This occurs because the initial wiring did not provide for increases in the use of electricity. An initial adequate installation and reasonable provisions for system changes provide for future increases in the use of electricity. Listen, the code says what? This is for safety. So the code is saying, listen, if you put something in, you got to make sure that you put it in so that when its system fails, it fails in a safe mode. That doesn't mean that if you do a calculation of 195 amps for a service, that you shouldn't use a 200 amps, because 200 amps will take care of 195, but the code says, well, information, just so you know, maybe you want to do a little bigger than 200 amps if your calculation 195 is information. The next thing is annexes. In the back, and these are informational annexes. Again, informational notes, informational annexes is just information. Product safety standards, raceway fill, examples, types of construction, tightening torques, ADA standards, and there are other informational annexes. An example of an annex right here, it says informational. Is that informative or informational?
That's an informative annex.
It's an informative annex where the other ones were informational notes. I just learned something. I didn't catch the little subtle point there. So this is just saying, hey, this informative annex is not a part of the requirements of this NFPA document, but is included for informational purposes only. So they give you some information in the back of the code book that might be helpful to some individuals in certain times. Then we go to definitions. Definitions are primarily contained in Article 100, and here's what it says. This article contains only those definitions essential to the application of the code, which means in general. It's not intended to include commonly defined terms or commonly defined technical terms from related codes and standards. And then it says, in general, only those terms that are used in 2 or more articles are defined in Article 100. Other definitions are included in the article in which they are used, but may be referenced in 100. So it's really important. There's a couple of things that you recognize when you're trying to use the National Code. Number one, you have to complete an electrical theory course because the National Code is the standard for the installation based upon the physics that take place. And you have to understand the physics that take place, so you have to understand electrical theory before you can even attempt to understand the National Code. Okay, so that's the first thing. You have to do that. So once you know theory, when you're trying to apply the code, if you don't know the definition of terms, an example, many places, and we can probably even do a search here, within sight. There are a lot of places in the National Code that says the disconnect must be within sight, the equipment must be within sight. It'll say a continuous load, or it shall be readily accessible. If you don't know the definition of the terms that's using by the code, then you're just kind of like, what does it mean by within sight? And Brian, how many within sight rules are there?
880.
880 times the code says something has to be within sight. Well, if you don't know what it is, you already screwed up 880 rules because you're just trying to make up what you think it is. And then in sight 100 tells us this. You got to be able to see it, but it can't be more than 50 feet away. So if it's 75 feet away and you can still see it, it's not within sight. So we have to know the definition of the terms, and that's contained in Article 100. But 100 made a reference that sometimes there's definitions that are contained within the individual article, such as in Article 406, which is what? Chapter 4, receptacles. Let's say the definition, because later on the code is going to talk about tamper-resistant receptacles that are going to be installed in child care facilities. Well, what's a child care facility? Well, since there's requirements in 406, which is receptacles or tamper-resistant receptacles in child care facilities, but see, child care facilities is only used in Article 406. So that definition will not be in 100 because it's only applicable to Article 406. So let's take a look at that. What is a child care facility? A building or structure or portions thereof. In other words, it's not the whole building. It could be a piece of the building for education, supervisory, or personal care services for more than 4 children 7 years old or less. Well, I have 7 kids, and there was a time I had 5 kids 7 years old or less. So in reality, I guess I had a child care facility just in our house there. But it's talking about there are places where you're going to have kids. And so therefore, when you have children, child care facilities, there are requirements in the National Electrical Code. So we need to know Article 100 definitions, and then we need to realize there are terms used in specific articles. Now, the last part of the code is going to be the index, which is in the back of the National Code. Now, index, I think we all understand they're going to be alphabetized. Readily accessible, Article 100. Let's talk about something else. Cranes and hoist, 61051. Access to working space. See working space. We'd have to go down the working space. So you can see some examples. Feeder and load calculations, Article 220. Brian?
I just think it bears mentioning here that the index can be kind of frustrating. The index is the terms as they're used in the National Electrical Code. They're not necessarily what we might call things in the field. They're not necessarily what we might order from the supply house. They're not necessarily, we even use terms incorrectly because we don't realize what they actually mean sometimes in the field. And you understand when you go to the index, you're looking for something and you can't find it. It's not because it's not in there. You probably don't know what it's called in the National Electric Code, and that just takes some getting used to.
You know, when you first get, well, we're going to talk about how to use the code in a second. I'm just trying to talk about how the code is structured. So sometimes I get to, so let me just go finish up. That's the index. Let's go on. Now, how to locate a specific requirement in the code. You guys with me there? How do I find something? Well, you know, that's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to find something in the National Electrical Code. And the best way for you to learn how to find something in the National Electrical Code is to get our product that is the questions on there. It's a practice questions book. And the questions start you what? In consecutive order. And then it starts giving you some random order. And then you start learning, oh, okay, Article 90. Oh, then you have some questions on definitions. It's that practical interaction by asking a question, answering a question, getting into your code book, marking it, and slowly we're like, oh, there's an article on motors. In other words, if you're going to try to find an answer having to do with motors, if you knew that motors was Article 430, well, then you already cut down that whole code book down I know it's in this section right here of the code book. If it had to do with receptacles, probably, okay, it's going to be in 406. So number one step is you have to get a practice questions book, and you're going to have to answer a lot of questions to get you into, if you have never had any experience and you give this to anybody, say, okay, where does the code say the spacing of receptacles on wall space? Well, there's no way you're ever going to find that. There's no way you can go to the index, I'm sure. You're not going to go to table of content. You're going to have some experience first before you get into that. What were you going to say, Brian?
I was just going to say, you know, when I first kind of got into the National Electrical Code, it was really a curiosity more than anything. I was younger, maybe 15, 16 years old. I was at the supply house. I think they had outdated versions of the code book cheap because the new version had come out, and I bought one. And I actually just started looking up the things that I was helping my journeyman do. Oh, we're going to install receptacles. I just started trying to figure out, well, where do you look in this book to find out about receptacles? And I really didn't understand a lot of what I read. But as I went on and I progressed through my career, I always would go back to the book and like, okay, well, you know, we're going to put in a high leg service here. And I don't remember exactly what all the rules are on that. So I try to look up some rules. And I think over time you just start developing a familiarity that the questions certainly help develop, but it starts to become real life.
If you want to learn the code book fast, I can tell you my total thing. You get the practice questions book and you go through that and you answer every one of those questions. You are peppering and finding little tiny things. You're scratching this and that, and it would take you forever for you to be able to learn. But if you go through 3,000 questions, you go to that whole book, boom, you got it. So that's the first step. Okay, let's take a look at the slide here. You know, the table of contents sometimes is, as you gain experience, is one of the faster ways to find rules. Because you know there's a section having to do with overhead conductors in a service. Well, then you go to table of content, you know that it's services, you look for, find out what part is that in the table of content. I mean, and then you just go there. When you start going into the index, now you're almost like, Eric, you like to say, you start going into a rabbit hole. You know what I mean? You start chasing this hole and you're chasing that hole and you're going here and you're going that. And there's nothing wrong with that because what happens, like what you did, Brian, you're trying to find something with high leg or you're trying to find something with receptacle. Let me tell you something. You never found the answer you're looking for, but you found a lot of rules about receptacles.
You spent like an hour looking and never find what you were looking for to start with.
Oh, I see receptacles about this and there's receptacles about that and there's switches about that. But you got to want to get involved, and you have to get involved, or you have to get involved. The next thing is the index. We talked about that, yeah. And you know the last thing is experience. Listen, you're not, and you know what? Even myself, I've been doing this. Now we're in 2016. I've been doing this since 1975, so it's 41 years. Don't think I don't have a problem finding things in the code book because I do have a problem finding things in the code book at times, and you know. Sometimes I just go with the electronic version of the code book and I'm like, let me find this thing. And I'm like, receptacle, whatever. And I go to the next one and I go to the next one and I go to the next one and I go to the next one. I'm like, I never would have found it there. I wouldn't have thought about that. So we do have electronic versions, but the electronic versions are a great way to use one term and start finding out where is this term used wherever it is. But I don't think most people do that. Index is okay and you can use that, but you need experience and then you need to customize your code book. Eric?
Yeah, and I'm listening to you talk, I'm listening to Brian talk, and both of you are using the word receptacle quite a bit. And what I mean to say is that if you want to look in the code book for receptacle, you need to know that it's called a receptacle. A lot of people call them outlets.
Oh.
And so, there's a facility in northern New Mexico that calls relocatable power taps fat Phoebes. And
we're going to talk about slang terms. And what you're saying is that, look, you better know what the technical term is. That means you better understand Article 100 because you're in the field. I got to be careful. I'm going to get into slang terms yet. Let me go there. I'm going to get there in a second. When you customize your code book, you have to have tabs. We happen to have tabs that are color-coded that actually matches our textbook. So like the first chapter, 110 is red. If you go to our textbooks, we're going to have red. If you go to chapter 2, all the chapter 2 are going to be blue in our textbooks. So all our text would be blue, and so you're going to tab. And then, of course, let's go to the black ones. The black ones is going to be 410, 422, 424. All the chapter 4s in our textbooks in chapter 4 would all have been black. Black borders, meaning there's a black border in our textbook. I'll show you an example here in the textbook itself. Our textbooks have a border. So we make it a point to try to make it a little easier if you take a look at the edge here. So when you go use your tabs, there's an interaction between our programs and, of course, our textbook. It makes it a little easier with all the different graphics that's associated with an item there. So, but that's about our book. That's not about the code book. Yes, Bruce?
So I want to say one thing, that this book, to me, when I first picked it up, was huge. Okay? And then everything Mike is explaining to you, going through the questions, going through Mike Holt, buying his products, it just shrinks the book down. Everything is just so much smaller than, I was so overwhelmed when I got into the code. And then when I started studying the code, everything started to get smaller and smaller and smaller.
You know what I did at one time when the code book came in a loose leaf? I took all the papers out and I took everything out of my code book when you get a little bit of knowledge that have nothing to do with anything I would ever do. X-ray equipment, the snow melting equipment. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I pulled everything out and I put it in the back of that particular section of the loose leaf binder. And so therefore, all of the most common rules I would ever deal with was in the front of the book. So I was able to make my code book because, in reality, in practical terms, I would say, if you were going to loose leaf that, probably you can make your code book 1/3 that size. Because there's so much in here that's so unique, so special, that doesn't apply to almost most individuals. All right? So how to locate a specific rule. David, top number 2 in the country in 2016, Top Gun code competition. What do you do to try to find something?
Actually, I did exactly what you said in preparation. I used whatever questions I can find, had your questions, and I went through, and that's exactly how I learned to get myself through and familiarity with the code.
Anybody else any comments on how you find something? Let's talk. Yes, Eric?
Well, like I said, you've got to know the terms, and I stress this so much with my students that, if it's a relocatable power tap, get in the habit of calling it a relocatable power tap. If you want to know what a receptacle, get in the habit of calling it a receptacle. Don't use slang terms. It is so important. Otherwise, you can't find anything.
Yes? David?
That's important too, because that's probably 90% of the reason why people have grounding and bonding, or bonding and grounding, and they get it all mixed up, is because they got their terms all mixed up.
You know what? And I'm not trying to plug my products, and that is that the advantages of our training programs, our books, our DVDs, are specifically designed for the electrical installer, the person in the electrical industry, giving the tools and the knowledge and the understanding of both the electrical fundamentals, the National Electric Code, the electrical calculations, and the words so you can specifically find it. Bruce?
They're like treasure maps. You have a treasure map, Mike Holt, he'll navigate you right to where you need to go.
Brian?
Well, I want to just take a second to talk about, we were talking about tabs and customizing and that it's designed for the people that actually are using the book. And I think the thing that I have learned the most since I've been here is this. If you can't learn how to get the information out of the code book, then the code book doesn't do you any good. Carrying it around, leaving it on the dash. We have little simple things. We have guys that are taking our tabs and putting them in the Understanding the National Electric Code books that are the instructions.
What's that? What you're saying is people are taking our tabs and actually tabbing the textbook.
The textbooks. And
our books.
Now when
make
they're
it
like,
easy for them to use our book to find
Sure,
them.
so they're studying in our books, right? And they get to a section and they're like, ooh, so they find the matching tab in their code book, and now they can just open up both books. They've got them side by side, and they're able to go through and see, oh, this is what the code means, because our language is designed so that somebody can understand in a very simple way what the requirements of the National Electric Code are.
You know, I wasn't thinking about that, but if you're trying to use the National Electric Code, you have to be able to understand what the National Electric Code says.
Yes.
And that's where our strength is with all the illustrations and all the graphics. If you don't have completed courses, if you haven't seen our books, you haven't done the DVDs, then it's just a bunch of pages and documents, and you don't even know what it's saying because you don't understand the context, you don't understand the illustration. You need to be able to have some tools to help you, and that's part of understanding the National Electric Code. Brian?
Well, so coming at it from an instructor, as an instructor, and I've got students and I'm trying to prepare them for their journeyman's examination, one of the biggest failings that I've seen in a lot of program offerings is that they're not preparing them using the National Electric Code. And so you have somebody that learns some things that they really don't know how they relate to the code book. And as you go through the books, if you have the code book and you have our textbooks and they're side by side, you're actually learning how to use the National Electric Code. And if you're going to go take a master's exam or a journeyman's exam, you're actually preparing yourself for the exam every single time you open one of the books.
All right, one last thing. We're going to close it up, having to do with the different interpretations by different individuals or arguing with somebody. My experience is generally when people have a disagreement in the field or whatever the case may be, they're actually not even using a code book. They're sitting there and just talking, well, I think this, and you say, well, I think that, back and forth, back and forth. The moment you're not using your actual, the physical National Electric Code book and having a discussion, then you're never going to resolve that issue between the individuals. So number one, have the code book. And also a reason of having conflict, the individuals have no training in electrical theory. They don't even understand why would the NEC say this, because they don't have the understanding of the physics. You have to understand the physics before you can understand the National Electric Code. And the third reason individuals have problems is because they don't have any real-world experience. Now, one of the advantages of our training programs is that we have this most amazing set of graphics and we explain things in the simplest way that you're going to get an experience that you would never have received because you might not be doing that installation. But by watching the DVDs, by looking at the graphics, by taking a look at the text, and then getting your code book, by taking practice questions, you're going to start building some confidence. And you have to understand, I'm talking to those of you guys that are just getting started, okay? But guess what? You are the next future leaders. You're the one that's taking the next generation. Mike Holt is going to be gone here. And what I'm hoping to do with Mike Holt and Mike Holt Enterprises is to be able to provide the knowledge and the information and pass that baton on to the next generation so that you guys can do maybe a little better job than what I have and my generation is going to be. So I don't want you sitting there thinking that none of this matters at all. It really, really matters because you're the one that's going to be taking the leadership role in the future. And we're depending on you. And I'm hoping that what we do as Mike Holt Enterprises and everything that we do is completely dedicated to making sure we help you become better prepared. And guess what happens when you get better prepared? You start getting those opportunities, you start making more money, you start feeling more confident, and more important than all of that is you were providing safe electrical installations. You don't want to do something and to kill anybody. So I'm done with about how to use the NEC. I'm sure we could do more, but I'm going to stop it there. But I'm going to ask our team members here that's helping us on this particular one, any final comments that you'd like to say? Bruce?
Yeah, don't let the inspector be your teacher.
Or don't let anybody be your teacher.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anybody else? All right. Well, listen, continue your quest. We need leaders. Don't let people put you down. Don't let them hold you back. When I was a young person studying, I was studying my code book and I was practicing for the test, guess what all the other trades, not all, but some other people would do with me? They laughed at me. They mocked me. Oh, you think you're such a big shot. Oh, Mr. NEC Code. Of course, they all took my classes later on so they could get their master's license. But that's okay. Listen, we want you to be successful. We want to be there for you. So God bless.